Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here during this session. If you're okay with that, Erica and Mary, we'll start with your presentations, and then if Cerae shows later, any case, he's expected to be the last presenter in this session. This is the third section of this third Carias conference under the title of Famous People and Places in Historical and Performative Texts. And we have three presenters today. Erika Steiner will be the first, Mary Salo will be the second, and if he shows up later, will be the third. Erika will share with us a presentation which title is The Fatal Style, the Scandalous Early Medieval Origins of Merlin Ambrosius. And, I will present Erika and give the floor to her. Erika is a PhD candidate of the Celtic Studies at the University of Sydney, and her research explored the history and historiography of ancient and medieval insular tattooing. Her previous degrees include the BA with honors in medieval studies and BS in marine geophysics. Her other research interests broadly incorporate the early medieval history of Northern and Central Europe, the emerging field of geomythology, intersections between the science and the humanities, and medievalism more broadly. Well, Erika, we hear you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks for the welcome. And I will just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes, but you are sharing all your screen right now.
Am I?
Damn. Yeah.
Let's go back. And there we go. Much better.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So let's kick on. The figure of Merlin is arguably one of the most enduring and recognised literary creations from the medieval period, being consistently popular from the character's very first appearance in the 12th century works of Geoffrey Monmouth up to and including the present day. And Merlin is found not just in popular culture and literary adaptations, but also in academic studies, which have often sought to extricate and identify the true Merlin from Geoffrey's texts. These texts are the, let's make sure I'm here. These texts are the Prophecies of Merlin, the De Gestis, the Deeds of the Britons, and the Vita Merlini, all of which were composed during the second quarter of the 12th century CE. The figure of Merlin within all three of Geoffrey's works is a prophet, a magician, but he is also a composite literary creation of Geoffrey's own creation from earlier sources. These sources pull together a figure of the boy prophet Emrys or Ambrosius from the Historia Brittonum, the figure of Lailochen from Jocelyn of Furness's 12th century Life of St. Kentigern, and Myrddin from Welsh poetry from the later medieval period. Even though the Welsh poetry is later, a lot of the poetic contents are firmly identified as being related to or composed earlier, and so they can be understood as antecedents as well as postcedents of Geoffrey's creation. Many scholars, in their analysis of Merlin, have sought to pin his existence to either a single historical time or even to a single historical person. And of course, in the medieval period and into the early modern period, Merlin was considered to be a historical person. Since the early modern period, this idea has shifted and it is no longer thought to be the case, primarily because of the supernatural feats that Merlin performs within these texts, the magic that he embodies. All of these were then put on the ledger against him being a real person, because when the magic and the supernatural elements became discounted, the person creating that was discounted too. But what we are looking for is not necessarily a single one person. So akin to the search for a real Arthur, again inverted commas, just like Merlin. There's a lot of modern scholarship which attempts to find Arthur within the early medieval period, within an individual figure. This is not necessarily the correct way. There's elements of real figures, there's elements of folkloric figures, there's elements of legendary figures all bundled into these stories that Geoffrey created, and Merlin is the same. What I want to do today is look specifically at the character of Merlin in the De Gestis Bretonum, as well as the antecedent from particularly the Historia Bretonum, from which he gained a lot of his text. Changed it a bit, as we'll see. But I want to try and also draw down the idea of, well, potentially there is actually a real basis to at least part of the Merlin story. And we're looking at a real character, a real individual person from the early medieval period hidden within these sources. So I want to put aside, well, first of all, Merlin has there's two real types of Merlin that we see in the medieval sources, not the modern ones, and that's the young Merlin, the boy prophet, and the old Merlin. And I'm not doing anything at all with the older Merlin. I'm only focusing on the young boy prophet Merlin here and what I'm talking about, because they are quite clearly in the antecedent sources to Geoffrey. They're different characters, they're different people, and they've been bundled together into one character by Geoffrey. So we're only going to be looking at the young boy prophet Merlin. And we want to look at the story, particularly where I get the name for my paper, The Fatherless Child. And we want to look at this story of the origins of the boy prophet and where he comes from. And that's in this concept of the fatherless child. So what do we have in the sources? So what I'll be doing is I'll be putting up the sequence of the story, where we've got the excerpt from De Gestis, which is the Geoffrey story from the 12th century, and I'll put up the corresponding passage or the corresponding portion of the story from Historia Bretonum, which is 8th, 9th centuries CE. So there's a big gap between the two stories. So here, what we've got going is, I'm sure that many people are familiar, but for those who are not, King Vortigern, who, whether he's a high king or a local king is not necessarily relevant to this part of the story, but he's got Magi. Do we translate them as wizards or advisors or some form of religious, magical sort of type of people around him, and they're saying that he needs to find this particular type of individual, a boy usually, the way it's translated, a youth or a young man that never had a father. Now it's very particular in the Latin that it's sine patre. It says a boy without a father, someone who's never had one. And the Historia Bretonum, you'll see in the highlighted section, the equivalent is a child born without a father. So the wise men of Vortigern advise him that he needs to find such a individual person within his kingdom and get that person over to the tower, which he's having problems with because the tower, as you might be aware, he's trying to build a tower in this particularly rocky, inhospitable part of his kingdom, and it keeps on falling down all the time. And he's been advised that the only way to do it is to sacrifice this child, and the blood will cause the falling down, that the disquiet within the kingdom will be solved with the death and the sacrifice of this individual. So that's what he sets his people out to do. And he's dispatched people to go out to his kingdom, and sure enough, they come across two, and they come across two people, two boys. Some of the texts say boy, some of the texts say young man. It depends on which one you're looking at, but juveniles of some description. And they come across these two having an argument, and in the middle of the argument, one of them famously says to the other, nobody knows who you are. You've never had a father. You're a fatherless child. And the messengers go, oh, hello, this is exactly who we need to solve our problem. So they go and talk to this, they go and get this child, and they also, in the Geoffrey version, they go to his mother, who was living in a nunnery apparently at the time. And then they get the two of them and they take him back to Vortigern. So we're moving back along, moving forwards in the story, and what's happened is that the child and the mother are then introduced to Vortigern, and here we have, it's quite obvious that Geoffrey has put a whole big story in place that's not present in his source material. So this is where we have the famous story that Merlin is the product of a sexual encounter between this young woman, when she was a young woman, and a demon, a succubus, and someone that came to her in the night, and she didn't know his name, and it was transpired to her because this person was never thought to be a person that it was explained that this was sorry, an incubus, not a succubus. I got it the wrong way around. And this was then explained in this story that, well, this is why this child has no father, because he's the child of a demon. You'll see in the Historia Brittonum, the early medieval portion, she's also said he had no mortal father. And it's very, very much more brief about what is going on here. So after they have this revelation that Merlin indeed has no actual father, Vortigern explains why he's looking for, he says here a man, but he's looking for a youth without a father. And he says, well, thanks for telling me. That's all very nice. Now I get to sacrifice you and sprinkle your blood, and my tower will be saved, and nothing will, and everything will be good. Will be good now. It's interesting that Merlin does not, or no one contradicts the king when they say that he has no father. No one denies any of this clause, the sine patri, but then it goes into Merlin instead. One might have thought, if you were accused of this, that you'll go, no, I do actually have a father. He's that person over there. But no one denies it. He instead counters the wise men, the magi, and he says, well, actually, the whole entire basis of your prophecy is wrong, and you don't need to kill me. What you need to do is dig up your foundations, and there you'll find the fighting dragons. And this is the famous prophecy of the of what was happening to Britain, and that's how it was interpreted in the 12th century and onwards, that it was a metaphorical fight between the Germanic and the Celtic, the British in the British Isles. That's what was being thought at the time. But what this is all very interesting, because what is going on here is something else entirely in the earlier text. So you'll see that this portion here, I've only given you what's going on in Geoffrey's text. And in Geoffrey's, it's all about the supernatural elements. It's all about what's going on within the tower, is the work of these dragons that Merlin uncovers and displays, and that's how he gets his reputation for prophecy is forged at this particular moment in time. And prophecy, as we know, was a particularly important element in the 12th century. There were a lot of prophetic texts that were being, it wasn't unique to the period, of course, but at that particular political moment, there was a lot of prophetic texts that were being circulated, and this fit very well within that. That could have been a reason why it was done in this way. But if we looked at the Historia Brittonum, there is a similar story, but there's far less detail involved. And what's actually going on in the story is, I think, much more interesting than any supernatural tale can be. So if we go back to have a look at if we think about the phrase that is peppered throughout these stories, the fatherless child, literally Cerae Patre, it's not possible for an actual child, an actual human child, to not have a father. It's not possible. So if we're thinking about it in reality, it's also not possible for there to be a supernatural father of the child. But what I think was going on here is we're looking at a remnant of Roman law, which is not being understood by the time it's being recorded in the 8th and 9th centuries in the Historia Brittonum, and it's certainly not being understood when we get to the period of Geoffrey a few centuries later. And we're looking at, if we go back from the 8th and the 9th century, when the Historia Brittonum was written down, and we go back another 3 or 4 centuries before that to when the actual period of the story was set, I think that we will find something very interesting for the context. So here you'll have 2 portions of text. The top is an excerpt from the Institutes of Gaius, which is a Roman law text from the right at this moment I have forgotten, but I think it's the 1st or the 2nd century CE, and it was commonly known and commonly used throughout areas of the Roman Empire, and these laws just built on one another. I think they weren't rescinded at any point. It was just what was useful. So within the Roman provinces of Britannia, this law would have been known. This law would have been a thing. So what we've got here in the law is the same phrase of sine patri, but what's happening is not that there's no child in reality or a supernatural father, but this is the only usage in the laws of the phrase sine patri is when you have the offspring of an incestuous relationship. That is, a father who is having a child with his daughter, or it doesn't say whether it's daughter-in-law, stepdaughter, or if that's even deemed relevant, but it is quite clear within multiple versions of this text that it is about it is an incestuous relationship, and the offspring of that incestuous relationship have no legal standing, and therefore they have no they have no paternus, they have no patria, they have nothing within the law. They are without a father in the law, not in reality. And I think this distinction is important and one that would have been known within the classical period. And I argue that because it's recording a situation that I think has happened in the early medieval period, this is also something that was known at that time. But sometime between the early medieval period of the 5th century or so CE, when the story is set, and by the time we get to the recording of it in the 8th and 9th century, the detail had changed and this law was no longer current at the time. And so the understanding of what was going on with this phrase, sine patre, had diminished. So that's the Institutes of Gaius at the top. And then the second text that we've got here is going back to the Historia Brittonum, which is we'll just go back one slide. So before we were at section 41, so this is section 39, so it actually precedes what we were talking about before within the order of the text of the Historia Brittonum. But what we've got here is it's quite explicit and it's quite clear that Vortigern, this is the king who's got the tower that's falling down, he married his own daughter by whom he had a son. There it is in black and white. And that's, I think, the key to identifying who this child is, who this fatherless child is. Moving on, we've got another little portion here of text to share, and this is after the prophecy. So I didn't include any of that prophecy part of the Historia Brittonum because it's not relevant to this part of the relevant to my paper at all. It's just the famous part everyone knows. What happens in the Historia Brittonum after the prophecy is this whole section in the middle there, where Merlin Ambrosius is actually giving his heritage and identifying himself and identifying his patrimony. Whereas at the top, you can see that the text, Geoffrey's text, only says Merlin was also called Ambrosius, and then that's it. They just closed off that whole area of what's going on because the whole premise of Geoffrey's text is that there is no father. It's the demon. The demon's the father. There can't possibly be a human father involved. Yet here, with the early medieval text, with the Historia Brittonum, we've got preserved ambiguity in what's going on here, and we've got multiple versions within the same story of what these original texts were. So here we can see that Ambrosius he's given his the Latin version. Ambrosius is also given the British version Ambrose. Guletic is an interesting thing because Guletic is potentially a title, so it's like ruler of the land. So he's like saying that my name is Ambrose, ruler of that particular portion of the land. And he's saying that he's got a father, and that father was someone with a position in the government, essentially. So with this period of change within the early medieval period, it's very hard to sort of pin down who's using British terms versus Roman terms, and there's a lot of complicated stories going on here. And then at the very third one, I'm just going to point that out because this is another, it's a sort of third story to weave into this within the same text, where Vortigern lists his own offspring, and again, it mentions quite clearly in black and white that he's had a child of incest. So there it's mentioned again. And I think it's ironic that the child is called Faustus or Lucky. at the very end there. So that ties in nicely with our theme of the conference. I'm going to start wrapping up, and I just want to, I won't go through all of this in detail, but one interesting portion, which I'm developing further for the written version of this paper, which has been in progress for a little while, is the idea of the leopard as a device, and the idea that the leopard, as we know from the medieval period, was sort of a byword for cheating, for betrayal, in terms of heraldic and other stories. And what we've got here is early medieval um, uh, relevant instance of the leopard, as well as a connection with not necessarily Vortigern, but with Vortipor. Very easy to get those names mixed up. Vortipor was presumably meant to be the son of Vortigern. But we've got this connection of the leopard with a ruler in this portion of Wales in the early medieval period. And one of the features of this idea of the leopard was cheating and wickedness and adulteries and shameful behavior. So that's one extra little thing to think about within contemporary early medieval texts, earlier by some centuries to what we've got in Historia Brittonum. And then just on the very last bit that I'll bring to attention is this part from Historia Brittonum, when this is what I think is actually going on with the tower. And so we know that the tower is, the story of Geoffrey with the tower is being built up and it's falling down because there's something within it, i.e. the dragons, that are causing it to fall down, according to the prophecy. But what's actually going on here, it seems, is that the tower, if we think of this tower and Vortigern's associated with another tower that falls down, that burns down, it crumbles because of God's punishment of his relationship with his daughter. And so I think that this is just solidifying this idea that there's this figure, Ambrosius, connected with the tower, potentially the ruler of it, who is the child of incest of the ruler, and this idea of why the tower is involved, because it was this symbol of it could have even been an actual tower that was whatever the word is, that was destroyed at one point during this period, and it's been connected in text with what's going on with Ambrose and Merlin ultimately. So, in conclusion, where am I? In conclusion, the early medieval period had an infamous tale of an incestuous relationship between a ruler and his daughter, which produced a child. But perhaps this story was too famous and was softened over time until the original reason for the crime was no longer understood, and the infamy of Ambrosius, Merlin, had to be manufactured by an artificial means, the story of the incubus. And he was too famous for his own good in the end. And that's where I will finish. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. What an interesting twist was with that analysis with the Roman law. We're a bit behind the schedule,
Sorry.
but no, don't worry. But we have, yes, the time for one quick question. If someone have one a question to do. Maria Gloria?
Yeah, if you want, I want to just, it was really interesting. Thank you, Erika. I wanted to point out to you just a reflection about the Sine Pater, because it reminds me of Sine Patriae, which in many European languages means without a homeland, a fatherland. could this be a possibility? The fact that the king wanted the child also without a father means without him belonging to another homeland or fatherland, or it was in a way connected to this sine patriae? Because being without a father, also, I don't know, I found it also connected to populations without a homeland is a population without a patria, a pater. So.
I think that's interesting. Thank you. I don't think it would have escaped people's understanding that it's connected, and so someone without a father, someone without clan, family is outside of the law and is free to prey upon and to take up in this instance. I think that's definitely true in a broader idea. But what I was trying to get at is that there's this specific phrase used in Roman law that's used specifically for this case, for the child of incest and what to do with them in terms of inheritance, particularly inheritance law, because they can't inherit anything from their father because they legally do not have a father because the union was illegal. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
very,
so, sorry,
sorry.
just to clarify, because it's about inheritance, and we're talking about the story of this tower that's within the supernatural Merlin story. The I think that is the inheritance because there's little hints that this Ambrose was the owner of land, was the ruler of some land, and then this tower that's always falling down and being destroyed through weird ways. This is all connected with this inheritance that this uh, the child of the incestuous relationship was given land, but then perhaps no one accepted that. Like that could be one potential explanation for this. It's all connected, and it's still a work in progress in a way. I still got to sort of tease out all of these little bits of it, but yeah, that's the starting point I'm at the moment.
Great. I have one of my own. It seems to me that from the quoted passages you show us, that in the De Gestis Britanum and in the Historia Britanum, uh, they refer this in different manners, uh, while in the De Gestis Britanum it appears like no father, and in the Historiae it appears like no mortal father. Or it was just maybe it's just for the passages you show us, and in other passages it's not like that. Um, well, I don't know. I was reading the passage and saw like three or two or three times uh, uh, this kind of correlation. And I don't know if there is something related to the date of because the Historia is the older one. I'm
Yes.
okay.
Yep. So the Historia is the old
Oh,
one from about the 8th
and
9th century.
about the date of the Gestis,
11th,
the-
12th.
yeah, and there are more circulation of the Roman law. I don't know if there is something
Mm.
there. Uh,
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that by the time the Historia Britonum was being compiled, uh, that what I tried to show is that there's potentially two or three different little threads of stories intertwined within the Historia Britonum, and that there's only one story in Geoffrey, but the earlier versions have sort of a couple of open-ended little portions, and it's not a neat story. But you're right, they do say that it's no mortal father, so they're trying to make that initial suggestion that it could be this incubus idea, this supernatural idea, and that was my suggestion that by the time that was being compiled in the 8th, 9th century, that particular idea of Roman inheritance law had already fallen out of use within the area. It was no longer relevant to that population. But I think that it was relevant 3 or 4 centuries before that.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. Well, now we'll move on with the Mary presentation. Mary will share with us a presentation under the title Fame in Public, Fortune in King, Gender and Value in Laxlida Saga. I don't know if I'm pronouncing right that. Mary is a graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan and University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and affiliated with the Center for Sami Studies, CESAM. Her research is interdisciplinary and brings indigenous and northern studies, particularly in circumpolar context. She's also a Toronto-based education leader with Toronto District School Board. Her historical interests include the medieval North Atlantic and early contact between indigenous people and Vikings. And Mary, well, the floor is yours, and we hear you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share and start my slide deck. All right. Thank you. Yes, I'm joining you from Toronto, Canada, from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And in here in Toronto, being such a international city, it's also a multinational Indigenous city. So we always acknowledge the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples here in the Canadian context. So today I'm going to be using the Laxdala Saga to think about the conference's theme, Fame and Fortune. Not really as abstract ideas, but this idea of them being social resources, because this particular saga shows people negotiating in public. So this saga is unusually explicit about how value works. So things like how reputations are made and unmade, how land and household become secure or unstable, how marriage, how kinship shape what's possible. And I want to suggest a simple model where fame and fortune are functioning like two linked currencies. So the saga's most dramatic scenes really become moments where one type of currency turns into another. So for a brief orientation, in case you are not aware of the Laxdala saga, it's an Icelandic family saga written no later than the 13th century, but placed in about the 10th century. It's set mainly in around West Iceland. A helpful way to picture it is it's a network of farms, of kinship groups, and they're all connected by visits, feasts, legal assemblies. And when things go wrong, they're also connected by feud. So when I look at feuds, it means this idea of cycles of retaliation and settlement that is sort of managed through law, but also through the support of kin. This particular saga is also famous because it reads more like a novel than many other sagas do. It has a generally coherent storyline. The first half is really does have a lot of characters, mainly related to relations of people like Kettle Flatnose, but then the second half has a very central storyline. And as a saga, it also gives unusual narrative weight to women, especially in the second half. Guthrun, who's often treated by many people as the saga's central figure, but really the central figure of the second half of the saga. Because of this really strong focus on women, some scholars have even suggested that there's a possibility it may have even been written by a woman. So this saga treats fame and fortune as practical problems as opposed to abstractions. So when we look at the idea of value, this really becomes legible through public actions. So whether it's pricing a purchase, that purchase could be even a thrall or a slave. Whether a land deal is fair. There's a point in one of the sagas where there's a discussion about the price of land because it was um, haunted by its previous owner, which I'll touch on a little bit later. This idea of witnessing a transfer of something of value, or even consenting to a marriage. There's a point in the saga where it said that Guthrun did not consent to her first marriage, which is actually what brought that marriage sort of bad luck, and it wasn't successful. And so this idea of the woman being part of the consent of the marriage, even if the parents are looking at some kind of, you know, alliance or bringing in funds to the family. So there's that piece as well. Then also this idea of fortune, that's not just about having, monetary resources or things of monetary value, but it's also about having resources that can be used without collapsing your social standing. And this idea that fame isn't just about being well known, it's also about being known in a way that produces some kind of a consequence, whether that's respect, whether that's the support of other people or your kin, or even the support of your kin for retaliation for some kind of perceived wrong. So this is the model for my paper, sort of in plain terms. So this idea that fame is something that's publicly legible, sort of reputational capital, and it's built through things like something you say or speech that might happen in some kind of a consequential setting, like an alting, which is like a gathering that often comes, there's legal things that happen in the alting. This idea of risking something in a very visible way, a willingness to respond to insults. There's many points in the saga where there has been some kind of an insult, and the women may have gather their kin and say, you need to retaliate in some way because of this insult to me. And so there's this model in terms of that piece. Sometimes even violence is framed as justified. There's one point where there's a character, Arthur Breaches, who her husband divorces her under some potentially false allegations. And so she comes and she brings a sword while he's sleeping, and she hacks his arm and his chest, and she doesn't kill him, but damages his arm permanently. And then when people say, "Oh, do you want me to, chase her, retaliate against her?" And he's like, "No, what she did was pretty fair." So this whole idea of this so that's an example of when violence was framed as justified. Or this idea of fortune as a durable infrastructure, whether it's about land that's yielding marriage alliances, inheritance, who are your dependents, your household's capacity to host feasts or give to other people or survive some kind of loss. So the saga's drama often lies on those conversion moments where you're converting from one to the other. So where resources or kin ties or objects suddenly become, really important stakes in reputation, or the reverse, where reputation forces a material response. So my first example is Un, who's an early matriarch in the saga's settlement generation in the early part of the saga. And the saga depicts her not only as wealthy, but somebody who organizes fortune. She has land, land claims, she distributes feasts and various types of fortunes. She has lots of social ties. One key moment in the story is when she has a feast for her grandson Olaf, Phelan, who she uses that gathering. Lots of people come from far and wide to this gathering, and then she uses that as a time to have many, many reputable witnesses to basically talk about her succession plans to give her property to Olaf. And so the feast is a socially meaningful audience, and Un uses that setting to really look at that kind of public declaration. And that dwelling that they're all at and all its contents are going to be going to Olaf. And so the point is that not just that she's a powerful woman, but the point is the mechanism that she's using. So she's that public witnessing is turning the household property into publicly recognized legitimacy. So that mechanism that she's using. Fortune, in this sense, is becomes sort of long lasting and durable because it's shared or made legible or witnessed in a way that many, many people can later affirm its validity. Another example from the saga is Melkorka. So Melkorka, whose storyline forces a difficult point where fortune isn't ethically neutral. So in the saga, people can be treated as property or thralls. They can be bought at a market and they can be integrated into household labor as an enslaved person, which is what a thrall is. And there's a character, Hoskuldur, who purchases Melkorka at a market. And then when that negotiation over her price she's described as having a drawback because she's presented as somebody who's unable to speak. And that affects her price and her perceived status and value as a thrall. Later, when she does, it's discovered that she does speak. She actually reveals that a noble Irish origin story, that she's the daughter of an Irish king. And so that affects all of the relationships within that household and slightly destabilizes it. She ends up having a son with Hoskuldur and as well. And Hoskuldur's wife is not very happy about this woman, not only because she's a thrall, but now she's also the daughter of a king. So that affects some of that household destabilization. And then there's also suspicion, there's accusations, there's deception, and basically it creates this. What Hoskuldur has to do is create two separate households to try and mitigate this. And what matters in terms of this particular part of the saga for this theme of fame and fortune is what happens next through her son, Olaf Peacock. He becomes very wealthy and he's publicly impressive, but then he still carries a reputational label that others use to block him. There's many who still call him a slave son. The fact that his father is a noble at the time of his death. So without that socially accepted legitimacy, wealth isn't cleanly converting into a stable honor or alliance. My third example is from Hrapstad, and it's about the value of land. So it's the idea of this in the saga where this particular land is considered unusable because the owner, Hrap, when he dies, basically is haunting this particular piece of land after his death. So this farm ends up being abandoned. He ends up as a ghost killing servants, basically making this land something that is doesn't have a lot of value because nobody can use the farm. So the place is deserted. Vigdis, his widow, refuses to live there. She relocates her goods to live with her brother, Thorstein, who takes her in. And then at that point, fortune is not simply about having resources, but having resources that can be safely inhabited and defended. In this case, bad fame is attached to this particular place, and it discounts the value by turning the assets into, basically a household risk. And a related mechanism appears sort of when you think about some of the unions that are in the saga, where sometimes a union becomes untenable and then there's a separation. And one interesting thing is several times in the saga, there are divorces, some divorces that the women have initiated, some that the men have initiated. And then, despite the time of the particular saga, property is equally distributed upon divorce. One of the most revealing places where the fame and fortune intersect in the Laxdala saga is divorce, because divorce isn't just about an emotional collapse. It's a public act. It has reputational pieces. It has law pieces. Guthrun is able to consult a lawyer as a woman, and it actually links directly to the redistribution of property and future alliance options. So when a woman leaves the divorce, she leaves with half the property, and then that actually becomes her property, which then she can bring into any future alliances that she has as well. So here we've got things like clothing. One of the interesting things, there's twice in the saga where clothing is used as a bodily display that makes separation something that can be action. So Guthrun wants to divorce one of her husbands. She has several over the course of the saga. She actually sets up her husband for the divorce. She purposefully makes him some clothing that has like a deep V neckline, which is apparently feminine. And then she makes it for him, so then he wears it. But then when he wears it, she says, "Oh, you're not a real man. I'm going to divorce you." And there's a similar kind of thing that happens between a man and a woman, where a character is a female is divorced because she's told that she wears men's pants. So that's a whole mechanism where their clothing is being used as a way to merit a penalty around separation. Interestingly, the divorce clears way for new marriage alliances, and the divorce functions as basically a value transfer, not just about a relationship ending. So there's this kind of logic that's happening through these kinds of material stakes, things that are heirlooms to kin, and all of those sorts of things. So this interesting legal history that happens based on 10th century Iceland, and it basically is related to that whole idea of public reputation and how fortunes are reallocated. So once divorce is on the table as a public mechanism, then you can see why objects in the saga become visible signs that matter a lot. They function as proofs of rank. They're also portable wealth. Another part of the saga is a situation where there's a character named Kjartan. He leaves for Norway from Iceland to basically become, that's one of the ways people would gain fame, was by going off and into other lands and maybe coming back with more money. While he's there, he had said to Guthrun to wait for him, but while he's there, he kind of his reputation is that he starts to spend a lot of time with a Norwegian king's sister, Ingeborg, and then he decides he's going to go back to Iceland. Ingeborg then gives him this really extravagant headpiece that has gold in it, and she kind of implies that like she was sort of planning on wearing it for their wedding, but since he's going back to Iceland for Guthrun, she gave it to him to take back for Guthrun. And it's described as having at least 8 ounces of woven gold into it and more beautiful than anything seen in Iceland. Kjartan returns to Iceland to find that Guthrun has married his foster brother Boli in his absence, because he was expecting this beautiful woman to wait for him for over 3 years. There's a whole other side story I don't have time for between the Boli kind of using his absence to marry Guthrun, even though she really loved Kjartan more. So this headdress enters Iceland already charged with ideas of rivalry and status. And it becomes this proof of portable prestige. When people see it, they envy it, they contest it, who should possess it. And at some point, the headdress disappears. And when people try to look for it, Guthrun's words basically imply that she stole it. She said, whoever took it took back something that really should have been their own. So you've got this conversion mechanism of where an object makes a fortune visible and the visibility makes it contestable, and then it quickly converting that display into everything from shame to accusation to conflict. And then the central plot line in the whole second half of the saga is this love triangle between Guthrun, Kjartan, and Boli. So Kjartan and Boli are foster brothers, and Guthrun and Kjartan are widely expected to be a couple and sort of the best match in the area. And as I mentioned, Kjartan went to Norway. And then various other things happen, which I don't have time to get into. But as a result, Guthrun marries Boli, and when Kjartan returns, there's this humiliation, there's competitiveness between the brothers, there's jealousy from Guthrun, and basically at one point, Kjartan is ambushed and killed. So that act locks the whole district into this long-term retaliations and settlements. And the key point for the theme is that isn't to get into every plot detail, but this idea that household, what people say in a household, marital pressure, kin obligations also become a mechanism that forces public violence. Because after the killing, Guthrun speaks in a way that makes the saga, that idea of value really explicit. She compares things like spinning yarn to killing, and treating violence as a deed of social value. And that can be weighed and interpreted. So this comparison treats violence as not just a meaningless emotional eruption. And so that catastrophe of conversion from one form of fame and money and is about kin obligation. So that public killing, reputations crash, and the saga spends the remaining arc of the story sort of looking at renegotiating alliances, compensation, shame, memory. So this model, I think, clarifies 3 things that are relevant to the conference theme. First, that fame depends on fortune's infrastructure. Reputation becomes consequential only when it's backed by household capacity, land, alliances, making that possible. Fortune is also stabilized or destabilized when you have public recognition of legitimacy, witnessing, narrative acceptance, stigma, labels. Are you a slave? Are you a noble? Whether wealth becomes durable. All of those things are around being whether you're stood up or you're socially precarious. And the third is that gender is not simply a public-private split. Instead, the saga repeatedly positions women as almost like conversion gates between those two areas. So consent and refusal of marriage, divorce and property separation, counsel, shame management, visible status. So fame and fortune in Lexdala are not separate domains. They're interchangeable resources whose conversion is patterned and contested. I'll end with one of the saga's most quoted lines, spoken by Guthrun when she's old, when she is asked because she's married several times over the course of the saga, and even doesn't marry somebody she loved very much at one, and is actually a big part of his death. When she's asked who she loved the most, her quote, she doesn't actually answer the question. All she says is, I was worst to the one I loved best. So it's a closing that refutes any kind of neat moral closure, so that even after fortunes are made and lost, even after names are secured or ruined, the saga leaves value unstable, emotionally, socially, ethically, and that instability is exactly why Lexdala Saga fits into this fame and fortune theme of the conference so well. It shows how reputation and resources circulate, how they convert into one another, and how the meaning of those conversions remain contested long after the deed. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Marvi. Really interesting your presentation. Well, we will remain a few minutes behind the schedule, but I think that we have time for one question. I have one of my own, but I don't want to monopolize the. Well,
Can I just make a comment? I don't have a question, but I would just
yes,
want
please.
to make a comment. I really appreciate, I'm not an expert in this time period, nor am I a literary critic, but I really appreciated how you tied your inquiry into materialist perspective, and how everything that you mentioned in terms of construction of kinship and fame and so on was really grounded in a sort of materialist history of this medieval saga. So I just want to say that I appreciate it and I learned a lot, and thank you very much for that. A question would be if you want to elaborate in terms of methodology, but I think Julianne might have a more a more interesting input on your presentation.
Thank you, Dimitra. I appreciate that. Are you in Australia? I see your poster in the background there.
Actually, no, I'm in Zurich. I do have family in Australia, and they were very gracious with gifting me the poster and sharing the same commitment.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you.
Well, I'm just wondering about if you use some kind of theoretical framework to conceptualize this. You are talking about currencies and value, and I'm wondering how these currencies are equated in the exchange. If there is something like because at that time, at least in the continental Europe, we observe the just price and how the exchange should be equated in some way to be a just exchange. But well, I don't know. I just wondering if you have worked with some theoretical framework to in that way.
I wasn't looking at it as much in terms of that. One of the things that I found really fascinating is trying to look at a bit of a
Oh, you froze. You're froze. Oh.
looks at these ideas of value and price within not just about men and fame and people going into war and all of this, and having almost like a bit of a feminist lens in terms of the um, how women have power and voice uh, and money and influence and are able to speak law, and doing it sort of as a comparative case study between a few of the key female characters in terms of that piece. And I know we'll never be able to know whether this particular saga was written by a woman, but there's a lot about it that makes people wonder that, because the women are, you have so much more depth in terms of their characters in this particular saga compared to some of the others. And this is kind of that comparative lens with that kind of a feminist slant to it that I was looking at in terms of the examples that I was pulling from the saga. But I'd like to, when you were talking about that particular piece, could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of what connection you were making?
Well, I don't know if you have time to
Yeah,
to keep much,
yeah.
but I mean, uh, it, I'm very interested in the way that the value are conceptualized. So uh, maybe it's just a way that you have to understand what is happening in the saga
Hmm.
using the term value. But when I see value, I think that there are different things that are valuated.
Hmm.
And in that sense, if we have something to measure that, make it can measure different things in the same way, and those things are evaluated, and in that sense, all those things can be equated in their value, one with each other. I don't know if that makes more sense in my question.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
So
to
in terms
understand
of,
what I'm trying to see. Um,
okay, so I see what you're saying a little bit more in terms of that piece, but I think that's something I'll reflect on a little bit more in terms of when I'm doing finishing the written piece. Um, but I think that's a really good point in terms of the equation, how you equate value, right? I think when we're looking at the Lextala, we've got, the valuation system actually a really strong law base in Iceland around how things are valued. Um, Even the idea of violence is within the law, where something is either something that can be actioned or not, not condoned. Um, there is a really strong piece in it about how um, when we look at rank, people's ranks are really important. And so value really comes through these discussions and how we've got alliance making and equalities actually come through those discussions where people almost need to negotiate uh, what is an equal value to something else depending on all those factors, like what is your social standing, what is the law, how are you connected to whatever happened, are you kin, is this land your husband's, your family's, is this object, who is it intended for? So I think you ask an interesting question that I'll reflect on, because how resources and reputations, it's really socially tied. There's a lot of really
mhm.
social pieces in terms of the saga. The valuation mechanisms are really, still land, marriage and alliance, object and status, shame and retaliation. Like there's a real there is that sense of a certain certain types of shame require a certain level of retaliation, right? Certain types of land require certain amounts of silver. And like that one example I gave around Hrapsted, the land was devalued because it was haunted. And then the person wasn't willing to sell it initially because the asking price was so low. And the person was like, well, I don't even know if I can use this land because the ghost is killing all the servants who are working the land. So then the person decides to sell it for the low price. I think there's if you translate it, it's something like you may have heard the saying, a crow in hand is worth more than, you know, whatever number in the forest. It's this idea of, okay, well, even if I only get a little bit for this land, at least it's better than nothing because right now it's giving me no value. I don't. So anyway, so yeah, thank you for the thought point.
No, thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll move on with Cerae. Are you there? Mahmoud, are you there? Can you hear me? All the other ones, can you hear me?
Yes, can you?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can.
Okay. Oh, there you are.
Oh, hi there. Hello.
Okay. Hello. Welcome.
Thank you.
Would you like to share your a presentation or something?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, let's try and check that works all right while I'm presenting you. The title of the presentation is From Bohemia to Byzantium, Winter's Tale of Fortune and the Syrian Gaze. Cerae Mahmoud is a scholar of medieval and early modern literature with research interest spanning transracial encounters, literary imagination, and the cultural histories of desire. His work examines intersection between Shakespearean drama, medieval English texts, and the representation of the Eastern Mediterranean. He has published on Gothic poetics, post-human feminism, feminities, and the reception of historical and literary geographies. Mahmoud is particularly invested in exploring the creative and performative dimension of literary scholarship, bridging textual analysis with imaginative approaches. An alumnus of University of Delhi, India, he participated actively in international conferences in medieval and early modern studies. He aspires to pursue a postgraduate Fulbright residence fellowship to advance research in medieval and early modern literature and culture, Shakespearean studies, and creative writing. Mahmoud, the floor is yours, and we hear you.
Thank you so much, Julian. Okay, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, here I articulate my talk for the day, and in this talk, I shall be briefing the outlines and extrapolations. That means the synopsises of the journal article that has been prepared for volume 13 of Cerae, an Australasian journal of medieval and early modern studies. Shakespearean engagements with Arabia and the broader Eastern Mediterranean have perennially been mediated through what later criticism would identify as an Orientalist imaginary, most famously theorized by Edward Said. And within this discursive field, the East is less a cartographic reality than a symbolic reservoir, an imaginative surplus through which early modern England negotiates desire, ulteriority, and transcendence. In this journal article, I put forth an argument that advances a psychospiritualist reading of fame and fortune as spatially refracted categories, resemanticized through what may be termed a Syrian gaze. Dear guests, in this framework, Bohemia in the Winter's Tale is not merely a pastoral or errant geography, but a site of lived volatility, where the instability of human fortune is dramatized through exile, loss, and regenerative temporality. By contrast, Syria, or more precisely, a Byzantine-inflected Syriana, functions not as a literal geopolitical entity, but as a projective eastern horizon, a space of imagined plenitude, sacred aspiration, and eschatological promise. This Syriana is psychically overdetermined, operating as a spiritual counterweight to Bohemian contingency. Theorization of a Syrian gaze does not index historical Syria per se. Rather, it encodes an English hermeneutic of the East, shaped by crusading memory, mercantile expansion, and mythographic inheritance. The circulation of fabulous motifs, phoenixes and unicorns, and other emblems of miraculous regeneration signals not empirical encounter but symbolic commerce, whereby the East becomes a repository of metaphysical value. In this sense, Shakespeare's East is a theater of projection, a horizon onto which England displaces its anxieties about fortune, sovereignty, and transcendence, while simultaneously aestheticizing them through the language of wonder. As Mahmoud F. al-Shatawi observes in Shakespeare's Orientalism Revisited, Shakespeare's dramatic and poetic corpus is replete with references to Tripoli, Damascus, Syria, Mesopotamia, the Nile, and the Euphrates, suggesting a sustained imaginative investment in the Arab and Near Eastern world. However, these invocations, while geographically suggestive, rarely function as mimetic representations of actual places. Rather, they operate within a symbolic economy in which the East is dispersed across a network of evocative toponyms, each carrying connotations of antiquity, sacred history, mercantilist wealth, and civilizational alterity. Furthermore, building on al-Shatawi's cataloging of these Eastern markers, this paper argues that such spatial references coalesce into what may be termed a Syrian gaze. Not a stable geographic orientation, but a psychospiritual horizon through which Shakespearean drama refracts questions of fame, fortune, and transcendence. The proliferation of Eastern place names, Tripoli, Damascus, the Nile, does not anchor the place in empirical geography. Instead, it produces a cartographic excess, a kind of imaginative overflow that dislocates meaning from place and reconstitutes it within a symbolic and effective register. In this sense, the East in Shakespeare is less a destination than a discursive field, a mobile, intertextual space shaped by crusading memory, biblical typology, and early modern travel narratives. What al-Shatawi identifies as geographical destiny may thus be reinterpreted as semiotic fluidity, wherein the East becomes a theater for the projection of England's anxieties and aspirations. It is precisely within this fluid geography that Bohemia, in the Winter's Tale, can be reimagined as contiguous with the Byzantine Syriana, a space not bound by maps, but by the psycho-spiritual logics of loss and redemption and miraculous renewal. Catastrophizing fortunes of Sicilia in the Winter's Tale, I shall curate the discussion forging ties with Leontis's jealousy as fortune's sudden turn, while focusing on the oracular decree and the paradox of Hermione's trial, as well as the death of Mamillas, eventually framed as a crucible of anthropomorphic exit by the spectre of a bear. That is, in the Winter's Tale, the catastrophizing of Cecilia's fortunes may be read as the dramatic inscription of fortunes' volatility within the psychic economy of kinship. Leontis's jealousy does not merely initiate the tragic arc, it enacts fortune's sudden and irrational turn, whereby sovereign authority collapses into epistemic paranoia. These effective rupture transforms Sicilia into a space of moral and political disequilibrium where perception itself becomes unreliable. The intervention of the Delphic oracle ostensibly restores a framework of divine judgment, yet its authority is paradoxically deferred and violated. Hermione's trial stages this tension with particular intensity. Though the oracle promises her innocence, the juridical apparatus embodied in Leontis's refuses immediate submission. The result is a profound disjunction between sacred truth and temporal power, exposing the fragility of justice under the sway of disordered passion. Dear guests, it is within this suspended interval between decree and recognition that Mamilius's death assumes its full tragic weight. His demise is not merely collateral but symptomatic, a corporeal index of Cecilia's spiritual collapse. The prince's death crystallizes the cost of Leontis's misreading, marking the point at which fortune's reversal becomes irrevocable. This trajectory culminates in the infamous stage direction Exit, pursued by Bear, where Antigonus's death externalizes the play's logic of catastrophe. The bear, at once absurd and terrifying, functions as an anthropomorphic threshold, a liminal figure that mediates between the human and the elemental, the symbolic and the visceral. So, in these moments, catastrophe is no longer contained within courtly or psychological registers, but erupts into the natural world, rendering fortune as a force that exceeds anthropocentric agency within Shakespearean Anthropocene. To deepen and historically texture these theorization of Syrian gaze, the geopolitical and cultural density evoked in Syriana or The Godfather Part 4 by Carl E. Mayer may be integrated as a contrapuntal modern analog, one that reveals how Syria continues to function as both material terrain and symbolic overdetermination. The following paragraph is crafted to align with my existing argument as afterthought of Mayer's travelogue political meditation, Syriana or The Godfather Part 4, which performs a striking contemporary inflection of what may be understood as the afterlife of the Syrian gaze, wherein the historical, the mythical, and or the geopolitical converge within a single overcoded landscape. Syria, in Mayer's account, is not merely a nation state, but a palimpsestic terrain spanning Bronze Age archives, Crusader fortresses, Ottoman legacies, and Ba'athist authoritarianism, an accretion of temporalities that resists linear historiography. This stratified vision resonates with Shakespearean East as a space of imaginative excess, just as Bohemia in The Winter's Tale destabilizes geographic logic. Mayer's Syriana dissolves the boundaries between past and present, reality and projection. Crucially, his characterization of Syria as a godfather state, structured through dynastic power, secrecy, and ritualized authority, then reframes the Eastern horizon not only as a site of metaphysical aspiration, but also as one of opaque sovereignty and controlled narrative. In this sense, Mayer's Syriana complicates the psychospiritual schema proposed here. The East is no longer solely a repository of sacred plenitude or symbolic regeneration, but also a theater of political myth-making, where authority is performed, history is curated, and external interpretation is persistently thwarted. Such a perspective underscores the Syrian gaze, whether in early modern drama or contemporary reportage, emerges from an interplay between projection and resistance, an unstable optique through which the East remains at once legible and elusive, materially grounded, yet imaginatively uncontainable. If I have time, then I would like to continue, or else I shall conclude here.
You have 5 more minutes, Mahmoud, if you want to.
Thank you.
I
Thank
was a
you.
little worried by the counting of your pages, but
Yeah,
we
30
won't have time
pages.
for the reading of the 29, but you have 4 minutes. Don't worry.
Thank you so much, Julian. Okay, while drawing parallels between Mayer and the Winter's Tale for exegetical deconstruction of Leontis's envy, I shed light on the excerpted passage that is in an often heard local joke. It is Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Yet, however stifling the cost, the Assads have imposed a rough and ready stability on an exotic patchwork of subcultures, although less violent and aggressive than Saddam Hussein. The elder Assad also preferred fear to affection. He let blood flow when challenged. In 1982, the British correspondent Robert Fisk was present in the ancient city of Hama when Syria's special forces, under the command of Hafez's brother, Rifat, put down a Muslim Brotherhood uprising, as Fisk recalls, in the Great War for Civilization. I stood by the river. Orantas, Assyrian battle tanks, shelled the ancient city. I saw the wounded covered in blood lying beside their armored vehicles, the starving civilians scavenging for old bread. And it was said that up to 20,000, it was said, died in the underground tunnels and in the detonated buildings. The real figure may have been near 10,000. But most of the old city was destroyed. Nowadays, Hama, otherwise known for its still surviving groaning water wheels, remains the reputed home base of Syria's Islamic militants. Throughout, the old lion was peacekeeper rather than peacemaker. Domestically, he offered protection in exchange for submission to a steamy pot of unassimilated subcultures, comprising not just Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds, and Turkmen and Druze, Alawites, and Islamilis, the latter being ancient patrons of the little assassins, another Syrian contribution to our lexicon, but as well as spectrum of Christian faiths, Orthodox Armenians and Greeks and Roman and Maronite Catholics and various Protestant denominations, not forgetting, as Aramic speaking sect in Malola, a hilltop town near Damascus, where a candlelit chapel, we heard a young monk recite the Lord's Prayer in what is said to be the language of Jesus. Dear guests, this passage from Syriana or The Godfather Part 4 may be productively aligned with The Winter's Tale through its staging of authority as a paradoxical fusion of paternal symbolism, coercive control, and a fragile cohesion. That is the quasi-theological imagery of dynastic power as figured in Assad triad as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost finds a suggestive parallel in the symbolic economy of kingship in The Winter's Tale, where Leontis embodies a similarly sacralized yet destabilized paternal authority, just as the Assad regime consolidates legitimacy through familial iconography and effective spectacle. Leontes' sovereignty, I argue, is initially underwritten by the ideological fiction of divine right, positioning him as both patriarch and arbiter of moral order. Yet in both contexts, then this paternal figure governs less through reciprocal affection than through an economy of fear and submission. So Mayer's depiction of rough and ready stability imposed upon a heterogeneous assemblage of subcultures echoes Cecilius's precarious political ecology, where unity is not organic but enforced and difference is managed rather than reconciled. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you for you have a clock there. Okay, well, we don't have really much time, but if someone has any question, yes, Erica, please.
Thanks, Mahmoud. I am curious. I wasn't quite sure where you're going with some of your points. I'm curious where it got into modern political discussions. I can you please explain the connection of the modern political Middle Eastern Syrian regimes to the actual early modern concept, or even a medievalist concept of the Syrian gaze, which is what you started off with. I didn't see the connection there.
Yeah, you wish me to contextualize Syriana's gaze to modern geopolitical spectacles.
No, more explaining your process of getting from where you started to pulling in the modern context. I wasn't clear on why the modern context was being brought into this discussion. So just some more context,
Yeah.
more information around your argument.
Okay, I have recontextualized from Bohemia to Byzantium, winter stains of fortune and the Syrian gaze. So, fame, fortune, and desire, these are liminal spaces within liminal geographies. And that is the gist of my bringing forth of argumentative narrative threads, you might term, because I have explored through Shakespearean Orientalism, revisited a post-colonial study of the Arab appropriation of Arabic Islamic illusions and matters in the Birds over, and then after that I shifted my gaze to Syriana, or the Godfather Bird from World Policy Journal. This is an elaborate article journal, and I don't have time to explicate in detail within this roundtable.
Thanks. I have the answer I need. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Ella, you want to add something or ask a question?
Yes, I just have a quick question. I'm wondering where, if you could define the term, you're saying that you're doing a psycho-spiritual reading of um, The Winter's Tale. Yes. So what is a psycho-spiritual reading?
Okay, I have shed light upon Leontes's psychodynamics, And I guess that can be a core takeaway of psychospirituality here, as far as the trajectory of my talk is concerned. And later on, if I further articulate the entire paper, then psychospiritualities would blur distinctions according to perceptions. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Mahmoud. With that, this session is coming to an end, and we need to leave the space for the next session that will be the second keynote of the conference. I think we can stop recording